Everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is part two of the agriculture series, and really, this is for people who are the second episode is for people who are interested in starting a garden but have no experience with it at all. So, I mean, it actually took a little bit of thinking because I grew up in a situation where we grew stuff every year. I mean, I unironically can't remember a time where I didn't grow stuff, and I have grown just about every plant that not only can grow in my zone for any agricultural reason, but also things that haven't grown in my zone, like really exotic, weird stuff. I've gone out of my way to try and grow, like tea and dragon fruit and um, uh, cucumber melon. That was a really weird one, aka pepino. It was yeah. Anyway, um, so so I'm trying to think of like things that somebody who has no experience with it, who's interested in starting one this year, would be advantageous to know. Well, first of all, find a good spot. You may have limited options given that you're probably picking your yard, but what you want to think about is where does the sun fall and what's a nice flat area. What has good amount of moisture. In other words, it's got proper drainage. If there's a portion of your yard or land where there's a lot of sitting water, it's probably not going to be great for most crops that we associate with, at the very least, the American palate. You can't. It's hard to grow corn and potatoes in a rice paddy. In other words, and likewise, it's hard to grow tomatoes and watermelon in a desert. That being said, they're very successful at it in Arizona and other arid places, but they really go out of their way to set up these irrigation systems that you probably aren't going to be able to afford or would want to take part in. So find a nice, flat, well-drained spot. That's step one. Make sure that it's got a lot of sunlight. I legitimately know people who try to start a garden and they put a good chunk of it in the shadow of this massive tree in their yard, and naturally, as you can imagine, it didn't do too well. So that's important. Lastly, the soil itself needs to be good. I mean, in terms of like location. Lastly, the soil needs to be good. If it's not, add things to the soil like compost and fertilizer to make it good. If you've got just nothing but red dirt and stones, you're gonna have a problem. Which is why I personally, if you're new to it, I highly recommend actually the raised bed style of garden, where you take compost, sometimes even mulch, or organic soil, and you make raised beds using interlocking little wood logs, basically. That is how I actually grow greens. That's the only thing I use raised beds for personally, but whatever. But it's really useful to get you in the swing of homesteading. And also, another really nice thing about it is, one, it looks good. So if you do have HOA or something like that to worry about, it's at least aesthetic, and you're probably not going to get complaints. And also, it gives you sort of a separation between the garden and the yard. There's a physical barrier that actually makes it easier to tend to, as well as sort of it keeps you from going overboard. Is where I'm really going with that. You don't want like a jungle in your yard or on your land unless you can get away with it. And if you can, by all means. But still, the raised bed system is really good. Another important thing to remember, this is sort of a twofold. This is climate issue. Know what zone you're in. Like I'm 6B bordering on 7, and I can really, because of my microclimate, I can really plant things that grow in zone 7, generally speaking, if I'm mindful about like the time of year, and that's part 2. In addition to finding out your zone, also make sure you know when the frost ends, because if you plant too early in the year or too late in the year, what's going to happen is the frost is going to either, best case scenario, damage what you've planted, and it's going to slow the rate of growth. Worst case scenario, it can wipe it out, and I've seen that before. I've seen early and late frosts just obliterate things, and an early frost is better than a late one, because if you grow something, you plant something early in the year and it gets killed, at least you can kind of start over. Whereas if you plant something and then there's an early frost late in the year, like when it's about time to harvest it, they all that work's gone down the drain. So very important. Likewise, know what you need to plant for that time of year. That's important. Strawberries, you don't plant them in June and harvest them in July. They're really more like an April to May kind of plant. And likewise, corn, you don't plant in April and harvest in June unless you live in my particular climate, which most people, again, I'm talking to people all over the country. That's It's going to vary. In other words, depending on your location, depending on your zone, and depending on the time of year. So just be aware of that. It is important. Now I'm going to talk about some of the ways you would want to set up a garden. If you don't use the raised bed system, you will need some sort of plow. Usually people will rent a tractor and get a little plow attachment to that, and that will help you upturn all that earth. And then once you've plowed it through a few times, and if it's virgin soil, in other words, if it's where nobody's really done that, it's going to take some time. It's going to take a few passes just to get that in sort of a quasi-garden state. And then after that, I highly recommend you take a tiller and go through it just to make that soil, just break it up and make it soft and ready to actually plant in. Just taking a plow to it. Theoretically, you could get away with it, but it would be really difficult, and I don't recommend that. So in other words, plow, then till, then hoe, then plant. Yeah, that's important. As for what people generally grow, at least in America, tomatoes are one of the most rewarding plants you can grow. They're actually kind of more difficult, though, than a lot of the other ones I'm going to mention, but I highly recommend it just because it is very rewarding. And I also, normally, I would recommend somebody plant heirlooms because they tend to taste really good. Oxheart, I love. Cherokee Purple is wonderful, but they're also a little bit harder to grow. So what I actually recommend if you're interested in homesteading is actually plant a variety of tomatoes, including the more modern hybrid varieties. And beefsteak, that one's actually pretty easy to take care of. That's a good one. But in other words, experiment with different varieties. Don't just buy one pack of seeds or of sprouts. That's another thing you need to consider. Do you want seeds or do you want sprouts? It's a little late in the year for seeds now. Unless you've started some already, you're probably better off buying sprouts at a garden center and just going from there. And they will have limited options. You probably, unless you live in a real highfalutin area, you're probably going to have trouble getting Cherokee Purple sprouts. So, yeah, just something to be aware of. The other one that I highly recommend, before I go further, with tomatoes, some varieties can grow on their own, but a lot of them need to be staked later or they'll just topple over, and that is very important. So get some chicken wire and some stakes to be able to do that. I use tobacco sticks, but you can use anything taller than I'd say 20 inches, bare minimum, just to provide a support. Otherwise it'll crumble under its own weight and die. And that's another thing. Tomatoes that touch the ground, for whatever reason, like osmosis, I don't know, they taste like dirt. So get rid of any tomatoes that, if you're doing the chicken thing like in my previous episode, you can give those tomatoes to the chickens. They love it. But it's just not pleasant, the tomatoes that have touched the ground. Tomatoes, that's the other reason why they're so rewarding, is they're delicious. If you grow tomatoes, you'll never want tomatoes from the grocery store again, because vine ripened, plus just the terroir of being properly cared for, it's almost like a meat substitute. They're so savory by comparison. Grocery store tomatoes are like water balloons. Another one that I highly recommend people grow are greens, because you pretty much can't mess them up. If you can't grow mustard greens or turnip greens, you probably aren't going to be able to grow anything. They are the kind of plant where you could literally just throw seeds onto a raised bed and you'll get something. I don't recommend you do that. You should actually put some effort into it, but they're very easy to grow. They need almost no maintenance. If you plant them thick enough, and that's another thing, tomatoes you can grow in a row, but greens, you're better off growing a patch. Plant them very close to each other. They'll outcompete weeds largely. You'll just need to handpick any weeds that come up, and that's really all the maintenance they need. They're really good about growing. Similarly, beets. Beets grow really fast. They grow really quickly, The beets themselves are delicious, but you can also eat the leaves and add them to salads, and it's just wonderful. Bib lettuce is great. Um, Cabbages, I highly recommend. I love cabbages. I grow them to sauerkraut. They do take a little longer, and there's one thing you have to look out for. That's about it, and that is they have two pests, and usually you'll just get one or the other. You might get aphids, but you're more likely to get cabbage cutworms, which are the same pests that affect corn and a few other plants. It's the same species. It's the thing that you see at the pet store, actually, the big fat caterpillars, the green ones. They're called hornworms. You might get those. And actually, there's another variety in my area that they grow into just the plain little white moths. Um, they look a little different. They're not the same, but the bottom line is the cabbage cutworms, things that eat cabbage. And what I recommend for that is bioinsecticide. I always do. I don't like Roundup. I don't like any kind of thing that could mess with bees or could kill non-pest species. You can get bioinsecticide that's targeted to specific pests anywhere now. Used to you had to like buy it online, but I've even seen it at Walmart now. So highly recommend that. It's a variety of Bacillus thuringiensis. Like there's Bacillus thuringiensis tenebrionidae that kills potato beetles, which I'll get more into that in a minute. And then other varieties of the bioinsecticide will kill cabbage cutworms and tomato cutworms and technically tobacco cutworms, but I'm not going to talk about growing tobacco, that's for sure. It's not really adequate for homesteading for the most part. But yeah, that covers greens and beets and cabbage. Corn is a little more iffy. If you have the space for corn, I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend the sweeter varieties, peaches and cream, ambrosia. Those are wonderful, but it's definitely one of those things that's going to be harder to do if you're like in a backyard. Even if your HOA is like, oh, chickens, that's fine. You're going to have trouble if you have a row of corn. But if you can, that's what you should grow. Corn, the only thing you really need to worry about. Cutworms are occasionally a problem, but really the big issue is keeping it hoed, because weeds will grow very quickly between corn. You could try the Three Sisters method, where you plant corn, beans, and squash together. And by beans, I mean green beans that grow on a vine called climbers. And what's great about that is the corn provides the support for the beans, so you don't have to stake them. You can't do this with tomatoes, by the way. The squash provides cover to prevent weeds, and the corn, which needs a lot of nitrogen, gets nitrogen from the beans, because beans are a nitrogen-fixing plant. They literally have microorganisms. I think it's a fungus, like symbiote, that helps them put nitrogen in the soil from the ground. Corn loves nitrogen, uses it all up, depletes it otherwise. And lastly, the corn, well, I already mentioned it provides support for the green beans. So it's just this wonderful little triune symbiosis that happens if you do that. And it does cut down on the amount of weeds you need. Squash, oh my God, if you plant 3 of those, you will feed your family all year, well, for several months during the growing season. Squash are extremely productive. Zucchinis, plant 1 or 2, and you will be giving them to people. They're just so productive. I mean, it's constantly, you'll just go out there and be like, oh man, more zucchinis, because the plants are just extremely productive. One other thing about corn, oh yeah, when it comes time to harvest, blackbirds and other bird pests are actually the most common nuisance. They're very smart, and they know when it's ready, and they like it before it's ready for you. In other words, before it's ripe for humans, that's when they want it, and they can just obliterate it. So you really have to be careful about that. You can do a lot of things. You can like hang a pie plate out and let it reflect sunlight. That tends to scare them, but yeah, that birds are really the biggest obstacle you'll run into when it comes to corn, and raccoons technically. Let's see, what else? What other plants would be good to grow? Oh, of course, potatoes. Forgot to mention that. Potatoes are really easy to grow, and they're also, because they're like a little shrub. They're by the way, tomatoes, potatoes, and peppers, and let's see, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants. They're all in the nightshade family. And the eggplants are the only ones of the nightshade that I'm not going to recommend. Just personal bias. I'm horrible at growing eggplants. I don't know why. I can't grow eggplants. But potatoes, because they're like a little shrub with little tiny white or purple flowers, you could stealth plant those like in your flower garden and nobody's gonna know. And then you just dig them up. You dig up the potatoes. And if you harvest them very early, you'll get fingerling potatoes. And if you wait until early autumn, you'll get just a bunch of regular potatoes. It's your choice. The only issue that potatoes have, they're very easy to grow, is potato beetles. And really, if you're growing a small amount of them, you can use bioinsecticide if it gets really bad. Uh, and by the way, the adults aren't really the biggest problem. It's that they have a bunch of babies, and these little orange slug-like babies just will decimate your potatoes. If it gets really bad, you can use bioinsecticide, but really just spot cleaning can really help, especially if you don't have a lot. I'll grow like 4 big rows, and that requires a lot more work. But if you've got like just a little tiny homestead amount of potatoes, look for little patches, little clutches of orange eggs under the leaves. By the way, if you see them under any other plant, leave them alone. They're probably ladybug eggs. But if they're under a potato leaf, they're probably potato beetle leaves or eggs. So get rid of them. Get rid of those eggs, and then spot clean. Kill any beetles that are just on the potatoes, and you should be okay. If it does get bad, though, again, bioinsecticide. Also, potatoes are one of the few ones that I don't recommend starting using seeds. There are potato seeds in existence, but they're really hard to find, and there's a good reason for that. Really, the best way to plant potatoes is just to cut a potato, called seed potatoes, in half and put them in the ground. And then each halved potato will grow into a new plant, which will grow mini potatoes. That's kind of how that one works. And it's kind of useful because then you can save the ones that you pick, just to get a few, save them back, and then you plant them the next year. So it's kind of this wonderful little self-replicating process. Let's see. We covered greens and beets and carrots. Grow them also close together in a raised bed. That's really about it for them. Just keep the weeds away. The only thing that really affects carrots negatively is if the ground retains too much moisture, they will mold. That's about it for them. So, yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where you daily maintain it by using like a hoe or gloves to get rid of weeds. And other than that, that's about all I've got for this. There's almost certainly going to be a subsequent, more advanced theories of gardening, but that really covers that one. So, like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions, and good luck with that garden. Bye.